Chapter 22 of A Little Queen of Hearts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Little Queen of Hearts by Ruth OGDEN. Chapter 22. The Little Castle's New Inmates. Nothing could have exceeded the air of importance with which Albert was striding along the streets of Windsor, and notwithstanding the shortness of his legs, his valet de chambre, in the shape of a newly acquired French nurse, had difficulty in keeping up with him. The fact was, Albert was entrusted with a most important piece of information, the bearer of a message that had cleared his own mental horizon from so much as the vestige of a cloud, and which, he felt sure, would bring equal joy to the others for whom it was intended. The destination toward which he steered, without deviation to right or left, and with great regard for economy of time and space at corners and crossings, was the little castle. And he marched up the path from terrace to terrace and rang the bell with all the complacency of a drum major. It was expected, of course, that faithful old Margaret, who was master-in-chief of affairs in the little castle, would, as usual, in the absence of the family, answer the bell, and the message intended for her was half-way over Albert's lips before he took in the fact that the individual who had opened the door bore about as close resemblance to Margaret as the tower of the little castle to its doormat. Why, who are you?" asked Albert as soon as he could check the impassioned utterance of his message, and instantly demanded in the next breath, "And where is Margaret?" "Here I am, dear," said Margaret, coming toward him as rapidly as an extra touch of rheumatism would permit. "And I suppose you wonder who this is, who has let you in?" "Yes," said Albert, whose anxiety as to who this intruder might be was somewhat allayed by Margaret's appearance on the scene. "Well, this is Mr. Everett Selden, Harold's uncle, who has come down from London to make us a little visit," Margaret explained. "Oh, that's all right then," favoring Mr. Selden with a benignant smile. And now, Margaret, I came round to tell you that they are coming home on Saturday. We've had a letter from Dorothy this morning, and they sent me down to tell you." Margaret fortunately was considerate enough not to take the wind out of the little fellow's sails by informing him that they had letters of their own that morning. "And Margaret, they will get here in time for luncheon, and I would have a very good luncheon, Margaret, and everything all bright and shiny." "Just as you say, Master Albert," making a little curtsy to the self-appointed master, and with difficulty restricting her emotions to a smile. Meanwhile, Mr. Selden stood on one side immensely entertained, for he had previously had no idea that executive ability ever had made a showing at quite such an early age. "And now," said Albert, free to turn his attention to less important matters, "did you open the door for me because you saw a little boy coming up to the terrace?" "Yes, that was the way of it," Mr. Selden replied. "But you did not know what little boy I was?" "Oh, yes, I did. Marie-Celeste told me about you one day when I had a good talk with her in St. George's." "Elaine," said Albert, turning abruptly to the French nurse, "I would like to talk to Harold's uncle, and I would like to stay to luncheon. I often stay to luncheon, don't I, Margaret?" Margaret's answer was that he often did, and Mr. Selden's assurance that nothing would give him greater pleasure at once settled the matter, and Elaine was compelled to return without her charge, but entrusted with the message to Albert's mamma that Mr. Selden would himself bring him home early in the afternoon. "I remember that Marie-Celeste told me," said Mr. Selden, placing a comfortable chair for Albert opposite his own, near the open window, "that you were very fond of a good talk now and then. And I'm very glad of that, because there isn't anything else that I could do to amuse you." "Why is it there?" said Albert, noting Mr. Selden's dressing gown and impressed with his semi-invalid air. "Aren't you strong enough to do anything but talk?" "No, I'm not so badly off as that yet, Albert, but you see I've lived alone so long that I haven't had much of an idea how to amuse little boys." "Why did you come down here when everybody was away?" For Albert felt that the case needed to be still further investigated. "Were you invited?" "Oh, yes, indeed I was invited. Harold's brother Ted invited me, urged me, I may say, to come whenever I chose and to stay as long as I liked." "How long do you think you'll like to stay?" "I think I would like to stay always." "Always till you die?" "Yes, I think I should. That is, if you don't mind, Albert." For Albert's sense of proprietorship in the little castle was very evident. "Oh, no, I'll not mind. Perhaps we'll grow to be friends, and often have long talks. Marie-Celeste said you had long talks in the steamer. That was how she came to know you so well. Yes, we did have beautiful talks on the steamer, but the very best one of all was in St. George's Chapel, a month or so ago. Yes, I know. As though there was a little of interest in Marie-Celeste that was not sooner or later confided to him. Did she tell you that time, Mr. Selden, about our night of the Garter Day? Oh, yes, indeed. And about this? Groping in the side pocket of his sack and producing a little circle of blue ribbon. I can't quite make out what it is, Albert, said Mr. Selden, peering anxiously at the rather indistinguishable little object. Well, that's what it is, and drawing up his kilt and trouser leg underneath, Albert slipped the garter over his foot and up to its right place, just about the knee. This brought the gold lettering partly into view and enabled Mr. Selden to grasp the situation. Oh, I see, he said. You made believe you were a little knight of the garter yourself. Yes, just for a bit of fun. I made believe I was a little knight all that day, but of course I didn't tell anybody, only Dorothy, who made it for me. But do you know, very confidentially, that I fell asleep in the church beside Timothy so that the garter showed, and then the children teased me awfully about it, and Marie-Celeste calls me her little knight now almost always. But you won't ever tell that I told you why she calls me that, will you? No, I promise, Albert. And Margaret, coming in just then to announce luncheon, the blue garter was surreptitiously removed and left for the time being on the library table, and was not thought of again by its rightful owner. Mr. Selden, finding it there later in the afternoon, slipped it into his pocket, with an idea of the use he might sometime make of it. For the next 3 days, to Mr. Selden's delight and amusement, Albert was a constant visitor at the little castle, and when Saturday came, he put in an appearance at a prematurely early hour, for fear, by any chance, the driving party should reach home before the time appointed, and, as that was exactly what they did do, he congratulated himself very highly for his extraordinary forethought. Not but what he had full 3 hours to spare, only the Allens, who were invited to luncheon at the castle, failing to reach there before the arrival of the brig, he felt that nothing but his own timely precaution had spared him a similar disappointment. That sounds like them, said Albert for about the 50th time to Mr. Selden. Hardly, I think, but humouring Albert to the extent of stepping out to the doorway, it is a whole hour ahead of time yet. But Albert was right, and a moment later the four-in-hand wheeled up at the gate, and the glorious driving trip was over. Who can that possibly be with Albert? Queried Harold, naturally mystified at the appearance of a gentleman, in the easy costume of housecoat and slippers, standing complacently in the doorway of the little castle. It's Uncle Everett, that's who it is, and climbing down the side of the coach, Ted was up the path and had him cordially by the hand in less than a minute. Well, this beats all, said Harold to himself, and what's going to happen next, I wonder? But he had the graciousness to defer his own greeting to Uncle Everett until he assisted Aunt Lou and Dorothy and Marie-Celeste to dismount by aid of the brake's steps, and which much practice, by the way, enabled them to accomplish very skillfully. Albert, you may be sure, was standing as close as possible to the foot of the steps, and tumbled curls and rumpled collars soon bore witness to an exceedingly hearty exchange of greetings. But the beauty of it was that everybody seemed to have every whit as glad a welcome for Uncle Everett as Ted himself, and for Mr. and Mrs. Harris the surprise was in store of finding that Marie-Celeste's steamer friend and Uncle Everett were one and the same person. But surprises being the order of the day just then, everybody was coming to take them quite as a matter of course. Mr. Selden soon sought out an opportunity to tell why he had been so ungracious as to not reveal his identity on the steamer, though he felt naturally that his explanation did not reflect very much to his credit, as was indeed the truth. But Mr. and Mrs. Harris were not the people to bear a grudge against anybody, if it could by any reasonable possibility be dispensed with, and, of course, other explanations were called for. Uncle Everett's presence had to be explained to Harold, and Ted told him all about their week together in London, but not yet about the borrowed money. That confession, together with all the rest, would be made a little later on, when Harold and he should have gotten a little nearer still to each other. Well, it was a merry luncheon they had in the little castle, but after luncheon the situation grew rather serious and pathetic. They had such a good time together for 4 happy weeks, it seemed hard each to have to go in his own way, and realize that all the good times were over, and happily even Mr. Farwell felt very sorry, too, notwithstanding he had been obliged to concede rather more than was altogether agreeable after Ted made his advent among them. End of chapter 22.
Chapter 23 of A Little Queen of Hearts. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Roohi. Little Queen of Hearts by Ruth OGDEN. Chapter 23 For Love of Marie-Celeste. Among the letters that Mr. Harris found awaiting him was one from Chris, telling him that he and Donald were booked for the Majestic, sailing from Liverpool the 1st of October. "All right," said Mr. Harris to himself. "We go too, then, if we can," which was somewhat of a question considering the crowded state of autumn-ocean travel. But good fortune still favoured our little party, just in time to secure staterooms, which within the same hour had been relinquished. So there was only 1 month more before them now, and 1 week of that Mr. and Mrs. Harris and Marie-Celeste were to spend in London. But the household in the little castle tried to make it a happy month with them. There was another cloud, too, that broadened and deepened as the month drew near its close. Uncle Everett was far from well. Just as first he had entered into the excursions and driving to which much of the time had been given over, but latterly he had preferred to stay at home, and now for a week he had been confined to his room. All the while, however, he was utterly uncomplaining, seeming to be bent upon making up for all the fruitful moodiness of the selfish old bachelor days up in London. And so the 1st of October came round, finding him still in his room, and there was no help for it but for the Harrises to take leave of him there. Everybody tried to make the farewells as cheery as possible, and Mr. Selden promised to visit the States later in the fall if he grew stronger. "If not," he said, "I'll see you all when you come over next spring to Ted's wedding," for that was another beautiful outcome of the summer. Ted was to be married at the close of his senior year, and the little castle was again to have a dear little mistress, a mistress as like to Dorothy as you can possibly imagine. When at last the moment had come for turning their backs on the little castle, 2 carriages were waiting at the door, for quite a party were going up to see them off at Liverpool, Ted and Dorothy and Harry Allen and Albert, but not Harold. His good-byes were said at the station, as it was planned they should be, and then dismissing the carriages, he hurried home as fast as ever he could, and straight up to his Uncle Everett's room. "Why, Harold, boy, what does this mean?" glancing from his easy chair toward the clock on the mantel. "Can it be the train has gone without you?" said Uncle Everett's, and Uncle Everett's face could not possibly have looked more troubled. "I meant it should," for Harold had tied up, as he called it, to Uncle Everett with all his heart these last 4 weeks, and he was not going to leave him alone and half ill in his room for even 24 hours if he could help it. "Oh, Harold, you ought not to have done it," but Uncle Everett showed how deeply he was touched by this strong mark of devotion, and Harold, drawing up a chair, sat silent for a few moments. The house had seemed so terribly bereft and lonely as he had come up through it, that he found he had hardly the heart to talk. And yet, what had he stayed at home for, if not to be, if possible, of some cheer and comfort? But there was no use in making an effort to talk about anything but exactly what was uppermost. "We're going to miss them a great deal, Uncle Everett," he said at last, "and it will be a comfort to get right to work at the studying," for it was high time that he and Ted were back at work again, for both had had to be excused from the opening days of the term. "All the same, I shall manage to spare you, Uncle Everett, for your visit to the States when you get stronger," for it was understood now that Uncle Everett's permanent home was to be within the walls of the little castle. Mr. Selden sat thoughtfully a moment, looking into the air before him, and then arriving at a decision, he turned in his chair towards Harold. "It may not be kind," he said quietly, "to tell you of it just now, when your heart is already heavy enough. But, Harold, I shall never be any stronger. The doctors told me what I had already suspected a month ago up in London." "Never be any stronger!" exclaimed Harold, almost defiantly, and almost overcome with intensity of feeling. "Well, I don't believe it, Uncle Everett, and they had no right to tell you that. It takes away half a man's chances." I made them tell me, Harold. I had so many things to change, and it is because they told me that I came post haste down here to Windsor while you were all still away, for I felt whenever it happened I wanted to die in the little castle, in a place I could call home, if for only a little while. But, Harold, I cannot bear to sadden you. It may be I shall live ever so much longer than they think, and get the best of the doctors. I only wanted you to understand that you wouldn't get rid of me for any visit." Harold tried to smile, but the situation was too serious. "The reason I've told you now, Harold, is because we may not have another good chance for a talk. And the reason I have told you at all is because there is something more I want you to tell you. I have been wondering, naturally, what I should do with my money, and I've decided to leave a fourth of it to you and a fourth to Ted. Yes, I know you don't need it, but you are my sister's children, and I want to do just this with it. But the other half, Harold, what do you suppose I'm going to do with that?" His pale face glowing at the thought. "What, Uncle Everett?" Harold's interest to learn relieving for the moment the overmastering ache at his heart. "I'm going to build a home down in Sussex. That's where your mother and I were born, you know, and a lady up in London, a lady, mind you, Harold, but who has lost husband and children and everything else in the world, is going to take care of it for me. Then as soon as it is ready, all the institutions for children in London are to be told about it, and whenever a little girl comes along who seems to be too fine, in the best sense of the word, for the life of the ordinary institution, down she is to go to Cranford, to be cared for in the home. And it is to be a home, Harold, prettily furnished, with rooms for 10 children, and everything as dainty as can be. You see, you can only keep it home-like if you limit it to rather a small number. And then when it comes to be well known with its family of dear little daughters, I hope that, once in a while, people who have had little children and lost them, and people who have never had them at all, and now and then a maiden lady, or even an old bachelor, will come down there and carry off one or more of the little girls, to bring them up as their own in their own homes, and so room will be made for others. Uncle Everett, that's the most beautiful. Wait a moment, Harold, for it isn't all told yet. In the living room of the home I am going to have a beautiful open fireplace, for of course there won't be any parlor. The most beautiful that can be made, and right above the tiles and under the ledge of the mantel I'm going to have the legend in gold letters that will shine even in the twilight, "For Love of Marie-Celeste." And then Mr. Seddon paused to see how the idea seemed to strike him. "Excuse me for a moment, Uncle Everett, for when boys' hearts grow too full they prefer to go off by themselves, and it is not a bad plan, by the way. I was a goose," he said, coming back in a few moments and putting his arms lovingly along the back of Uncle Everett's chair. "But you see, it was one thing coming right on top of another so," knowing that Uncle Everett understood. "Isn't there more to tell now?" "Not only this, Harold, and that is that the orders are all given, and that whether I live or die, the home will be ready by next autumn." And who would have imagined, to look at the light in the two faces, that they were really standing face to face with the grave, mysterious thought of death. The Majestic is lying, with all steam up, out in the Mersey. Chris is leaning over the ship's side, and Donald, again in sailor rig, is close beside him. For Ted had dispensed with Donald's services when he decided to follow up the driving party, and he had at once hurried back to Nuneham to help Chris, who was trying to get everything into shape for the old people before leaving. The tender, with its second and last load of passengers, is bearing down on the steamer, and now they can distinguish the Harrises and Albert, of whom Chris has heard so much, mounted on Theodore's shoulder. Marie-Celeste holds in her two hands a generous bouquet, which was handed to her as she stepped aboard of the tender. Its roses are bound together with a little blue garter, which she was quick to recognize, and she knows very well she has need to thank Uncle Selden for this priceless souvenir for that happy night of the garter party. Foremost among the number to leave the tender is a man in livery, which some of the passengers have at once identified as none other than that worn by the servants of the Queen. "Whom do you want, may I ask?" questions Donald politely, since the man once aboard seems hesitating which way to turn. Inclined as first to resent the interference, the man stares at Donald a moment, and then, possibly conciliated by the semi-official aspect of his sailor costume, condescends to reply, "I have these," motioning towards the articles in his hands, "for one of the passengers, Miss Marie-Celeste Harris." "Here she is, then," answers Donald, for the Harrises have that moment come aboard. "Are you Miss Marie-Celeste Harris?" asks the man, taken aback by the suddenness of her advent on the scene. "Yes, I am," Marie-Celeste replies in a voice all but inaudible with surprise. "Then the Queen's compliments, miss, and a bon voyage." And grandiloquently delivering himself of this little speech, he presses two packages into her hands, and retreats to the tender before she has at all had time to take it in. Marie Celeste stands a moment, and observed of all observers, and specially of those who have overheard the message. Then our little party, moving off a short distance by themselves, crowd close about her in breathless excitement, while the papers are removed from a glorious bunch of orchids. There is a card attached that reads, "For the little Queen of Hearts, from Madame la Grande Reine." The other package proves to be a tiny velvet box containing a curious, quaint necklace, and this bears the inscription on one of its ends of faded ribbon, "End of chapter 23. End of A Little Queen of Hearts by Ruth Ogden."